Welcome to the Real Crusades History podcast. Today we are continuing with our series of podcasts on the Third Crusade. In fact, we're nearing the end of that series. Our topic for today is going to be the Battle of Jaffa, the final military engagement of the Third Crusade. I'm J. Stephen Roberts, and I'll be your host. I'm joined by Editor-in-Chief of the Real Crusades History blog and our own resident military historian and Marine, Rand Brown.
Hey, good to be here.
Great to have you, Rand. Welcome to the podcast. And Rand and I are very pleased to welcome two regular guests here on the podcast, Dr. Helena Schrader, a novelist and historian of the Crusades. Dr. Schrader, welcome.
Thanks, I'm glad to be here.
We're also quite pleased to have Dr. Stephen Donnachie, a Crusades historian from Swansea University. Dr. Donnachie, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you very much for having me.
Great. Well, let's pick up where we left off last time. So after Richard decided against an attack on Jerusalem in July of 1192, he moved his army back to Acre. Saladin decided to use this opportunity to try to turn the tide of this war with Richard and reclaim the advantage for himself. At this point, Saladin had been consistently defeated by Richard. He'd lost several important cities and castles, and he wants to reverse that. So Saladin assembles a sizable army, and on the 27th of July, he moves on one of Richard's most important power bases, the coastal city of Jaffa. Dr. Schrader, what do you think of Saladin's strategy at this point?
It's brilliant because we all know that Richard had already had the word that he needed to return to the West, and he is under, therefore, incredible pressure. But Jaffa is the closest port to Jerusalem, and although we've withdrawn from Jerusalem at this point, the risk is that the call of Jerusalem will still be a rallying call for the Crusaders, and they're most likely to move from Jaffa. By moving against Jaffa, Saladin exposes Richard's weakness. He basically he cuts him off. He goes for the jugular, is I think the best way of putting it, because if he can take out Jaffa, there's no hope. There's no way, they could ever make a new assault on Jerusalem. And he exposes Richard for being, defeatable, and therefore further discredits him and sort of pushes him off on his way. He could also, it makes, as I think you've already mentioned, Saladin needs a battle success at this point. Richard at this point has built up Ascalon, and by taking out Jaffa, he cuts off Ascalon and almost assures that he can retake Ascalon, and at the same time would humiliate Richard by taking away the port closer to Jerusalem and make it almost impossible for them to make a new assault.
Right. Dr. Donnachie, what are your thoughts on this?
Oh, no, I'd agree with that very much so. Jaffa is the place that any further attempts by the Crusaders to take Jerusalem is going to be launched from, and indeed any attempts in any future crusading are going to want to go from Jaffa. So by cutting it off, by recapturing it, it makes any attempts that might come along increasingly more difficult. It also isolates Ascalon, of course, which is obviously a big concern for Saladin in regards to the security and connection with Egypt, between Egypt and Syria. And yeah, Saladin needs some sort of victory. He's had this constant toing and froing, this wearing down, this endless skirmishing for quite some time, for months and months between Richard's army and his army. And he needs something. He needs something much more tangible to have some sort of morale boost, some sort of propaganda victory of some description. And taking Jaffa and isolating off the coast and taking back the things that the Crusaders have captured would do that. It would be quite tangible, and that would make quite a boost to the morale of his army, which has been campaigning year after year, just worn down his army and made them very tired. They're becoming increasingly exhausted from consecutive campaigning. More so that if he takes Jaffa, any negotiations, any discussions as to what's going to happen in a post-Crusade world, in the post-Crusade Latin East, is going to be dictated by who controls what along the coast. And by having a bigger piece of that sort of post-Crusade pie, as it were, Saladin's in a much better, stronger negotiating position against Richard to bring Richard to negotiations to try and end the conflict, and force have the upper hand and force something in through the negotiations. And by taking Jaffa, by isolating Ascalon, he's in a better position to do that.
Yeah, good points, guys. Rand, what do you think?
Really, Dr. Schrader and Dr. Donnachie really covered it very well. What you're seeing now is Saladin is energetically pursuing the initiative, trying to take the initiative back in the fight. And the best way to do that is to go for the critical vulnerability of the Crusader states as a whole, and that is their coastal cities, which connect them with the maritime support from Europe. And he's also slicing in half the coastal territory that they've seized under Richard, so that the southern half is now completely isolated from the northern support up in Acre.
Yeah. So on July 28th, Saladin's army overwhelms the Christian garrison at Jaffa. Saladin promises the Christians they can leave with their lives and property, and that the city will not be pillaged, but it turns out he can't control his troops. His Kurds and his Turks sack Jaffa, and so the Christians refuse to depart the citadel. Saladin posts his Mamluks by the city gates to take the booty off the Muslim troops as they come out. So, Dr. Donnachie, what's going on here? Why do Saladin's troops refuse to obey him at this point?
Saladin's basically there's two issues here. One that's probably more prevalent and one that's lesser that feeds into it. The first one is that this is not necessarily his troops willfully and maliciously sort of disobeying his orders, in conscience, that's what they're going to do. They're not going to pay attention to him. But the sort of perennial problem that happens in medieval warfare, and indeed happens in warfare throughout a lot of history, is that an army that's broken into a city that it's been trying to attack for the last couple of days, and they've had several days of siege, of bombarding the walls, and assaults on the city, simply runs amok and takes out their anger and their frustrations and their problems, their issues. Their bloodlust and their adrenaline is up, and they take it out on the people who in the city. The city is sacked, and this is something that happens all the time, repeatedly. It's very much just a facet of medieval warfare at large. So on the one hand, you've got that happening, and they break in and they start killing and plundering. But on the other hand, there is the aspect that Saladin's army is a coalition built up around himself of various emirs and other lords and princes from the immediate Near East and Egypt, etc. And he's been campaigning with this army, calling upon them for people to send troops for year after year after year. And ultimately, to what gain? The frustration within his army, the discontent has grown. And certainly in the period sort of earlier in the summer, when the Crusaders were starting to march towards Jerusalem, there were murmurings, there was resentment, there were animosities and rivalries flaring up within the army between his emirs and indeed between the Turks and the Kurds. And no doubt, as soon as the opportunity, that the army is let loose in the city, and it's hard to maintain any kind of order over this army running amok in the city, they just use the opportunity to do what they want. And they're already maybe annoyed and bothered by Saladin, and now the opportunity to be let loose is there, and they do. And this is a world in which these troops, these Turks and Kurds, aren't a professionalized force of some description. That's what the Mamluks, by comparison, are much more professional in that regard, these slave soldiers trained to do this. So that's why he puts them on the gates, so that when they come out with all of the loot and all of the plunder, some of which had come from the caravan that Richard had attacked only a few weeks previously, all of this plunder coming out, they stop them and take it back and things like that, because the Mamluks, by comparison, are the more controlled, more professionalized, more elite units that can do that. So it's not always necessarily a case of willful disobedience as opposed to medieval armies doing what medieval armies do.
Right. Rand, what are your thoughts on this?
Dr. Donnachie covered it very well, especially from, the kind of the psychological aspect of it. Something also to keep in mind is that the economic side of this, and why you see this kind of thing happen all over medieval history, and really pre-modern history as a whole in warfare, is that this is before the times of professionalized, armies at the financed by the nation state, and things like regular pay and all that kind of stuff. Salaried troops didn't really exist at this point, except professional mercenaries, and the plunder and pillage, that was also a lot. There was also a lot of economic interest in that too. I mean, that's how most of these troops would, whenever the campaign was over, it was usually all they had to show for it. Like Dr. Donnachie covered, this is an army that had been out in the field for a very long time, and had relatively little to show for it. So you're going to have troops that they're going to want to rectify that at Jaffa's expense.
Yeah, if you're an average soldier, that's almost going to be, well, that's going to be a serious motivation for why you even go to war, is this idea that you can pick up plunder. Dr. Schrader, what are your thoughts on this situation with Saladin's troops?
I have very little more to add. I guess I would only point out again what I mentioned last time. It's that in the meantime, the countryside around has been pretty devastated.
Mm-hmm.
So these troops, and we've been seeing that Saladin's had his own supply trains cut off. So there's even a degree of feeling deprived, I would think, that's helping to spur this. And I'd like to underline Dr. Donnachie's point. This is a coalition. A lot of these troops are not particularly loyal to Saladin at all. And they follow their own emirs, their own local commanders, and if those guys decide they're going in for the loot, that they're going to take advantage of that.
Yeah. So while this is going on, Richard is at Acre, and he gets word of Saladin's attack. What he'd been doing at Acre was planning an attack on Beirut. So before leaving, his idea was that he was going to continue to mop up the coastal fortresses. But he immediately gathers a small force and sets sail for Jaffa. Ernoul gives us this rather dramatic description of this. He tells us that when Richard's ships approach Jaffa and Richard sees Saladin's banners flying over the walls, he grabs a Danish axe and calls out, "By God's calves, they will not capture the Christians." On August 1st, Richard and a few dozen knights, a few hundred infantry, and a force of Italian crossbowmen storm the shores of Jaffa. Richard and his men quickly penetrate into Jaffa itself and battle through the streets, cutting down Saladin's men. Richard manages to clear Jaffa of Muslim troops and regains control of the city. So, Rand, what do you think of this amphibious assault on Jaffa and Richard's unlikely quick recapture of the city here?
For me, it's definitely one of the most dramatic episodes in the entire Third Crusade, and also one of the most important. Not only just from a sense of what it accomplished for the Third Crusade, but also just the demonstration of Richard's military capability. When you read the descriptions of this action in the primary sources, the things they're describing Richard doing with this amphibious assault on the city, you can almost transcribe it into current day amphibious warfare doctrine. I mean, this action right here really demonstrates just how almost ahead of his time Richard was militarily, because you really don't see an amphibious landing, a forced amphibious landing like this in pre-modern warfare as a whole. Usually amphibious landings were conducted, it was really just transports coming to shore and troops disembarking and whatnot. Almost never do you see a forced amphibious landing like this, under fire and immediately engaging in combat on a beachhead. The other thing that's really interesting to point out is that the reason why Richard brought so many crossbowmen with him is that I believe it's in the Gesta Regis Ricardi, but they actually describe the crossbowmen providing covering fire from the boats as the troops were landing, where you get this whole notion of combined arms attacks are not something that the modern world invented. It was uncommon, but you're seeing an operation that if we were to change the names of the equipment, could easily have been an after-action report for an amphibious landing today. We still utilize the same tactics, supporting fire from supporting maritime fire and things like that. So it really does it's to me, it's my favorite episode of the Third Crusade, because it demonstrates Richard's military acumen far better than any of the other engagements he was in my opinion, and also shows really in a way kind of how ahead of his time he was and how creative he could be tactically and strategically. I would say the only other thing I would add is that this is also a perfect demonstration of why the coastal cities were so important to the Crusader kingdom, because by having a string of coastal cities like this, with the the maritime support that was incumbent in them, they could provide this kind of rapid response, or what we would call today QRF, quick reaction force, to another city that was under threat. And notice, I mean, how quickly Richard is able to respond to this.
Yeah, good comments. And Dr. Schrader, I know last time, well, not last time, but when we did the Cyprus podcast,
Yes.
we there was kind of a preview of this.
I was just going to say, actually, Richard has done this before. The difference being that, of course, the troops of Isaac Ximena were mercenaries and not very loyal to him, and he really ultimately didn't face that great a resistance. His advantage here, or not, it's really not an advantage, because I think we should stop back and think about it. The accounts, Baha ad-Din talks about 300 men with Richard, as possibly as many as 1,000. And at most 17 mounted men later, when we get to August 5th, as I'm sure we will. But I understand he only went with his household knights of about 50 men. So this is an extremely tiny force. So although I agree with everything Dr. Rand said about this being a brilliant combined operation in theory of it being an amphibious force coming in with covering fire, I think that doesn't give enough credit to the fact this was very, very tiny force against a massive army, and it should have been disastrous, no matter how good the idea of, covering fire from your crossbowmen. If you've only got maybe 500 to 1,000 of them against an army that's allegedly 20,000 strong, that should have been nothing. And the only two things, obviously, part of it, Richard obviously has this incredible charisma, and his men follow him and they jump into the water with him. And again, very dramatic descriptions of him. He jumps overboard. He's, the water's still up to his groin. He's carrying a crossbow in one hand and the axe in the other. He fires the crossbow as he comes ashore. So he's demonstrating, he has before, he's familiar with these weapons that are normally handled by common soldiers and not knights. And he doesn't bother with the shield. I mean, he goes ashore with fighting two-handed. Amazing, imagery here. But I think we have to think, why on earth was he successful? And I think we're back to the fact this was an army that thought they had already won. Saladin's troops must have been so sated from sacking the city, and some of them were still in the city sacking, that they really weren't prepared. Because if you read the accounts, he does arrive in time. They see him coming. They have time to stream down to the beach. But they couldn't have been truly fighting fit, or I don't see how, with, a maximum of 1,000 men, he penetrates to the city, crosses that beach.
I think
maybe
Dr. Schrader.
I
think Dr. Schrader. I think the best answer I think that we can get from the sources is that this was a maneuver that completely took Saladin and his army by surprise.
They just didn't expect them to come.
I don't think they ever would have thought, that he could have brought a force to the city's aid that quickly. And you're right. I think they were. There were probably some large elements of the army still inside the city, still preoccupied with looting and sacking. And as we've seen before in Saladin's career, that's one of the big reasons he lost at Montgazard was, his elements were all out, separated, all and little raiding parties.
Yeah. Plus that, as we already discussed, there were some issues in Saladin's army in terms of the cohesiveness of the various contingents and rivalries springing up and that sort of thing. But yeah, I have to agree with both of you. I mean, all the times I've read about this battle and read all the different accounts, and it's just amazing that this turned out to be a victory for Richard. I mean, it does seem like it should have just been so easily defeated. And, not only do they successfully land, but they actually get into Jaffa and then fight their way through Jaffa and clear it of the occupying troops. It really is an amazing... And yeah, I do think, Dr. Schrader, I have to agree with you. I mean, Richard was just a very unique person. I mean, he was a really outstanding commander who seemed to inspire something almost superhuman in his troops. It's pretty remarkable. Dr. Donnachie, did you want to comment on this episode?
Yeah, Richard sets out from Acre, and a main army goes down the coast towards Caesarea, where it gets held up by ambushes and skirmishes and attacks by the rest of Saladin's army. That's under Henry of Champagne, Balin of Ebelin, Hugh and William Tiberius, and that has the Templars and the Hospitallers in it. That's the main core army of the Crusaders coming down the coast. And I think Saladin is genuinely surprised, as has been mentioned. I think he's genuinely surprised because he wouldn't expect the main army to come down the coast as it did. But it had taken, in the run-up to Arsuf, which is a comparable distance, Acre to Arsuf, Acre to Jaffa, had taken 17 days to do so. And I think Saladin is expecting a similar kind of time scale thereabouts to for an army to make it, for that relief army to make it down to Jaffa. And I think he thinks he's got the time to deal with the citadel, to have negotiated surrender, to deal with it. And he almost does. The citadel is almost falling through negotiation at the time that Richard turns up. So I think he's surprised by this. And as such, his army is more dispersed in and around the area about Jaffa and up towards Caesarea. And what he's actually got is Richard comes ashore and he doesn't have to fight the entirety of Saladin's army to get to Jaffa. He's got to fight those elements that are closest to it. So I think the number of troops that get, the numbers that are bandied around for the number of troops that Saladin had in Jaffa was about 3,000, those who are keeping an eye on the citadel, those who are still wandering around sacking and plundering and everything else, the Mamluk guards, etc. So Richard's got to come ashore and is forced a landing amphibious, which is he's done before. He did it on Cyprus, and this is a greater challenge in this regard. So he's got some experience, and Richard does it and he succeeds. But he manages to fight his way through these smaller elements and flush them out of the city, so that Saladin is completely caught by surprise by this. So when he turns around, his army isn't all there and all ready to go to repulse Richard and counterattack and drive him back into the sea. He's caught on the surprise by this because he's expecting this main army to come from the north, and he thinks he's got the time to deal with Jaffa before turning northwards.
So what you're saying is the figures that we have for the army that attacks Jaffa, which was where I was getting the 20,000, in fact, at this point is dispersed because half of them at least have gone up the road to block the army coming down that they're expected down. Okay, that's a very good point.
Have this army of like 20,000 people, of 20,000 cavalry, I think is the thing that's usually banded around, and a questionable amount of infantry, as always the case with source material. But it's not all concentrated on Jaffa. He's got Jaffa secured. He's all bottled up. He's only got the citadel to worry about, so he doesn't need to keep his army there. And if he's got this army, who's doing all the ambushes and attacks and the harassing of the main army coming down the coast? So I think he's got it all more spread out, kind of like it was at Mongisard. Because he thinks he's got more time than he actually has, and this catches him completely by surprise, and for Richard's benefit in the end.
Yeah, so those are really great comments, Dr. Donnachie. So basically, Richard has this opening in that Saladin's troops are spread thin, both occupying Jaffa and to meet these other Crusader forces, and that is something that we do get from the sources. Is I think even some of the ships that were coming down weren't able to make it to Jaffa. So even from the naval side of things, Richard had a reduced number of resources to work with.
The weather was apparently not too great off the coast of Haifa around the Cape there as you go past, and so it was delayed for a period of time. So some of the ships got held back. But yeah, it's still a hard fight for Richard to get ashore, and we shouldn't detract from that.
Right.
But I think he's got... We shouldn't see it sound like this, huge monolithic kind of, army sitting there waiting for him on the beaches as it goes. He's still got a hard fight ahead of him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I believe it talks about him landing on the beach underneath the walls, beneath the walls, and engaging with the immediate forces that were right out there outside the city, and then very quickly turning inwards, back into the city, dispatching all the forces that they caught. That were still caught inside the city, and then now Saladin is faced with having to literally retake a city that he had already taken, because now it's Richard and his little task force are now inside.
I think we shouldn't underestimate, obviously, the sheer problems that Saladin's got to face in this. Is that he's aware that Richard's coming ashore with this small relief force, but being able to command a battle in the middle of a city, especially in the Middle Ages, is not an easy task. So even if he can do anything about it, he's maybe just better off just waiting for Richard to flush them out, because there's nothing he can really do to stop that, because it's a hard task. More so, there's still people in the citadel.
Yeah. I agree that I don't think once Richard had gained the city that he had that much difficulty, because then his numbers, his few numbers, aren't as critical. He can then go street by street, and you're using the buildings as your flanks, etc. And so a small force is always at a greater disadvantage in the open field than it is in confined space. The troops that were still in the city were probably, as I say, not terribly disciplined. I'm a little bit more concerned about the fact is I understood it. The bulk of Saladin's army was actually camped outside of the city, so that although they'd taken it and then sacked it and then they went back out to the camp, and as you say, whether they gave up their loot to the Mamluks or not, the bulk of the army was still actually outside the city. And when Richard comes ashore, there's a camp of Saracen troops outside the city, who are the ones who come down to actually meet him at the shoreline and try to prevent his landing. He cuts through them to get into the city, and then he can push out, let's say, the people that are still in there with the help of the garrison that is already out and joins him. So by the time he gets into the city, it's no longer just his 300 to 1,000 troops, but I understood there were like 4,000 men in Jaffa. Maybe half of them are dead now. He gets reinforced by, say, 1,000 men. But there's still that large force outside of Jaffa. But he got some ideas about what happens to those troops, because they later talk about him camping the same place that Saladin had set up his tent, outside of Jaffa.
Well, Dr. Donnachie, weren't you kind of saying that Saladin had been dispatching troops to conduct some raids, to meet these other Crusader forces on the way, that sort of thing?
Yeah, so there is this camp outside, and Richard drives them from the city, drives them from the camp. Saladin withdraws. I'm not sure. I mean, there is this camp there, and it is a center, and Saladin's obviously been here for some time, and he's had the city kind of isolated and bottled up through the siege. I'm just wondering how much there is in this camp at the time. It's maybe so their base where they're based around, but how much of his army is there, and for such a small force to be able to overcome such staggering odds, I'm wondering. And there are other troops out and about attacking the main army coming down from Caesarea. I just question how much of the army that Saladin's got is at least in the position about Jaffa to have any effect on the outcome of the battle, whether or not there's other troops elsewhere down towards Ascalon or further afield or whatever they're doing. What's Saladin got to play with? What's he got to actually use at the time when he's confronted all of a sudden by Richard turning up?
Which I agree with 100%. It's a very good point. But I'm still saying it's not just a matter of taking the city. He actually also has to drive whoever that is, and even it's only a small force of several thousand men, they still have to drive them out of that camp as well. Because they actually force Saladin to withdraw, and he pulls back actually quite a distance at this point.
So the besieging camp, Richard takes control of that too.
Exactly. Because we're about to get to August 5th when he's attacked. Well, he's outside the wall because his army actually doesn't stay inside of Jaffa.
That's right, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so are we ready to kind of go with what? Okay. So Richard has retaken Jaffa. Saladin is understandably disturbed by this and how things are turning out. But despite Richard's astounding recapture of Jaffa, Saladin believes that his much larger army should be able to easily crush Richard's small force, and that comes from Baha-ad-Din. He makes that point. And so Saladin decides to launch another attack. On the 5th of August, Saladin deploys his army against Jaffa. Richard draws up his men in a shield wall formation outside the city. When Saladin's troops encountered the Christian force led by Richard, we're told by Baha-ad-Din that many of them refused to attack. Saladin's own Mamluks charge the enemy, but suffer heavy losses. Richard himself fights at the front lines. Baha-ad-Din has some interesting comments about Richard's formation. He says, "The enemy stood firm and did not move from their positions. Like dogs of war they snarled, willing to fight to the death. Our troops were frightened of them, dumbfounded by their steadfastness." Okay, Dr. Schrader, what do you think? What's going on?
I'm not sure I'm the right one. I mean, the shield wall, as I say, goes back to ancient Greece. It's not really a new tactic. you can hold, and the idea of putting their lances into the ground and using them as stakes. We see it again, of course, at Agincourt. We'll see it when Louis the ninth goes ashore at Damietta. He uses the same formation just to establish his beachhead. I don't think there's anything really remarkable and unique about it, at least in the Western tradition. We clearly, if Bahadid says that they were surprised by it, it may more be that he's surprised by the fact that so few men were willing, as at Agincourt, to just face down a large body of cavalry, because we're going to assume at this point that Saladin has used the 5 days to recall his troops and pull his army back together.
Yes.
At least those that aren't blocking the army coming down from Caesarea, and that they are facing substantially larger numbers. So it may be more that respect for the kind of steadfastment of Thermopylae. It's like there's only 300 guys out there, and they're facing us all down.
And what you're saying is about the sources, Dr. Schrader, that is true. That's kind of the major thing Baha'u'ddin emphasizes. Is he even goes through, like you were saying earlier, Dr. Donnachie, this list of kind of estimations of how many troops there were even there, and he's just amazed that this is just this small group. Dr. Donnachie, what do you think?
I mean, Richard's been in the city for a couple of days. He quickly attempts a haphazard repair to the walls and gates of the city, which were breached during Saladin's siege, and then proceeds to set up a sort of palisades, these stakes, the sort of from the ships, from the camp, from everything you get in the city, to act as a barrier, the sort of brief sort of fortification, these pickets, as it were, which of course is going to cause any problem for anyone trying to attack in his position, which is again, we said, it's this sort of shield wall, and again, this is nothing new. Shield walls are well-known use and tactics, but we have obviously this image of the dominance of cavalry in the Middle Ages, but repeatedly throughout the Middle Ages you have these instances, like at Agincourt, or like at Hastings in 1066, Bremul in 1119, here at Jaffa, Courtrai in 1302, where infantry, well-trained or rather disciplined, interlocked infantry, cause horrendous trouble for cavalry, and it happens here again. He's got a decent amount of men. He's got obviously everyone he's brought with him who survived the initial assaults and attacks. He's got whatever's left from the garrison within the citadel of Jaffa, and also Henry of Champagne has turned up on a boat with a boatload of people, while the rest of the army is still marching its way down the coast. So he's got a sizable force, and all Richard really has to do is hold out, because he knows the main army is coming. And likewise, Saladin knows the main army is coming. And if Richard can hold out long enough until this main army arrives, Saladin either has to leave from the relief force or face a direct engagement in an actual pitched battle, which is not what he really wants to do, and it's not since Arsif, and he's avoided that. So Saladin's in a bit of a pickle, really. He's got to dislodge and get rid of Richard and take Jaffa back before this army comes by. So Richard takes on an option that is the best option for him, which is to hold firm. And in a world of Turks and Kurds with Muslim armies, with a predisposition towards cavalry and fire and maneuver and all these sort of things, a shield wall that isn't going to budge, is just going to sit there consistently, that has set up obstacles to keep the cavalry at bay, is a nightmare. Also, is that when the cavalry finally get close, Richard and the Earl of Leicester, who's with him, and his handful of knights that he's got, charge out into the Muslim cavalry as it comes up to them, attacks them, and comes back. And you get these stories of Richard and various other knights coming back with so many arrows and things, and they look like hedgehogs. And Richard does this again and again and again, just stays there secure, not denying the ground to Saladin and not budging.
Rand, do you have some comments about this stage in the battle?
Yeah, I do. I mean, really, Dr. Donnachie really hit on several points that I think are very important in this episode. As both Dr. Schrader and Dr. Donnachie mentioned, the shield wall is by no means nothing or anything new, in at least in Western warfare up to this point. But one thing to keep in mind is that it's also a tactic that has worked before against Muslim armies. with the Battle of Tours with Charles Martel. That's exactly how he defeated the Moors that punched up from Spain and turned them back. Was by utilizing the shield wall with his Frankish troops. It's how the very first large scale battle of the First Crusade, the Battle of Dorylaeum, was able to hold out successfully. Was Bohemond's contingent dismounting and putting the heavily armored knights out front in almost a shield wall type formation. And it's something that highlights, without getting too much into the still very, very heated debate amongst military historians of, is there such a thing as a Western way of war versus a non-Western way and all that sort of thing. But it does demonstrate yet another example of the difference between the two ways of war, between the Western Crusaders and their Islamic opponents, and that in Eastern cultures, there is very much sort of an aversion to close quarters melee combat. They've demonstrated that consistently for millennia. Whereas in the West, there is very much an emphasis placed on heavily armored close quarters melee combat, and they excelled at it. And that they even Muslim sources talk about that in the Crusades. Calling the troops of the First Crusade the men of steel or the men of iron. Because their chainmail was so powerful. Was so well made that even their arrows didn't have that much of an effect. By Richard taking that stand and digging in and using the shield wall formation, he's forcing his Saladin's troops to fight them where they have the advantage, and forcing them to step out of their comfort zone of being able to like Dr. Donnachie said, fire and maneuver and skirmish and things like that.
Essentially, this is simply an immobile formation similar to what Richard used on the entire march down the coast. He always had his infantry and his crossbowmen between the enemy and his knights, and then they sorted out when they felt they saw a weakness in the enemy. So he had to do that while he was marching at Arsuf, which was considerably more difficult than what he had to do here. Dr. Donnachie's point is he really did just have to hold. Mm-hmm. He had to resist this attack, but he didn't have to. And by just resisting, he defeated Saladin.
Right. Good points. And I guess one other thing we might want to bring up here, Dr. Schrader, you and I, in our email exchange, kind of talked about this fascinating passage in Baha ad-Din. Did you want to read that?
Oh, I'd love to.
Great.
Just be sure I can find it here. Okay. This is quite. The number of their cavalry was estimated at the most at 17, and at least as 9, and at their foot were less than 1,000. Some say 300, others more than that. The Sultan was greatly annoyed at this and personally went around the divisions urging his men to attack and promising them good reward if they would. Nobody responded to his appeal. I have heard that Al-Jannah, Al-Mastoub's brother, said to the Sultan, "Your Mamluks, who beat people the day Jaffa fell and took their booty from them, tell them to charge." The Sultan saw that to stand face to face with this insignificant detachment without taking any action was sheer loss of face. It was reported to me that the King of England took his lance that day and galloped from the far right to the far left, and nobody challenged him. The Sultan was enraged, turned his back on the fighting, and went to Yazur in high dungeon. I love it.
That is picturesque, and the fact that it comes from a Muslim source is even more fascinating. It sounds like at some point while this was going on, and I guess this might be a combination of just the Muslim troops were afraid of Richard, and also the fact that there was this fractious thing going on in Saladin's army that and which seems to be demonstrated again by what's said there. But yeah, Richard was able to just ride up and down Saladin's lines and nobody would attack him. So he was pretty much what Richard is doing here is he's openly mocking Saladin.
Well, I think it also just demonstrates just how demoralized Saladin's troops were after this whole after this whole incident, here it was. I'm sure many of them had thought, that the initiative had finally returned to them, and that they were taking back these cities, and the good times were gonna start coming back. And now, here Richard, miraculously
ruining
shows
everything
up.
again.
Yeah, with this tiny little task force, elite task force, but a tiny little force, and completely undoes everything that they've gained, nearly, and now they're digging their heels in, and presenting them with having to come fight them where they've the Muslim troops already are at a disadvantage, with close quarters melee. And I really do. I think that incident where the one leader tells them, no, we're not going to go in. You send your guys in. It's
Yeah.
it's we're not going to go. We're not going to go. We're not going to go commit suicide for you. You go send your own. Go send your own troops. Who, by the way, took all our loot. And
I think
so
that's very significant.
And
Yeah.
what? But
I
what
think
is
that's
this?
very significant. That resentment of having had their loot taken away.
Yeah.
I think we shouldn't underestimate that.
But what's this thing where Richard is able to just ride up and down the lines and nobody does anything? I mean, surely somebody would have pulled out a
Crossbow, yeah.
I mean, what's going on there? I mean, that just seems. What do you think, Dr. Donnachie?
It's in Bahardin. It's also confirmed by Ibn al-Athir, who mentions that Richard rides out and offers the challenge to people, and no one takes it up, and he rides back again. I think it's fatigue and weariness. I mean, apparently there have been 7 waves of attack of 1,000 cavalry each that have been made against Richard's position, and all have been defeated, all have been beaten back, and all of them have broken on the shield wall and all this sort of thing. Who really wants to make the 8th? No. I mean, really, it's human nature, really, isn't it? I mean, who really wants to make the 8th attempt? Is this going to be the one? No, when all the others have failed before them, especially when you look at your commander and you look at Saladin, and why aren't you chipping in as much as the rest of us?
It's the interesting psychology behind defeat. It's when and you see this multiple times in throughout history, that once a sense of defeat becomes widespread in a force, it doesn't matter anymore. They're a spent force, and it they could still have thousands, they could still have tens of thousands of men there, but if the infection of disease, or if the infection of defeat has spread throughout the entire army and has become the psychological precedent, it's over. And
Rand, I agree with you 100%. But the question was, why don't they assassinate Richard? Because it's one thing to say, I don't want to be the next wave and I don't want to die. That means I'm not going to attack. But when he's riding up and down the line, it's a different factor which is holding them back from somebody trying to kill him. And I think that you may have hit on it. You may have hit it on your head when you mentioned, where's Saladin? And there may actually have been a sense of perverse respect for the fact that Richard was there where Saladin was not.
Yes.
At the head of his troops.
And this entire engagement of Jaffa just demonstrates also, and I think I mentioned this earlier, but just demonstrates Richard's leadership capability. I mean, he was very much a from the front leader. And he was that way in every engagement he fought, almost to legendary, degrees. Whereas Saladin, you don't ever really get the same sense with him.
He didn't personally fight.
No.
Nope.
He was back there at the command center.
Exactly. You very much get the sense that Saladin is a from the rear commander, and leads through delegation, and I think it is, Dr. Schrader, I think you're correct in that there was maybe sort of a begrudging respect for an enemy leader who demonstrates leadership far more in a far more inspirational manner than their own.
Yeah.
Dr. Donnachie, you're just being quiet.
No, I'd agree. I mean, I think they're wearied, they're fatigued. That they just don't want it. There's no point. Does it achieve anything for them? Maybe killing Richard, but there's a begrudging respect there. I mean, Richard does become this sort of, quasi sort of boogeyman in popular stories and things in the period afterwards. Richard will come and get you and all this sort of thing.
Yeah, Muslim parents would tell their children that.
Children,
right?
yeah, if they're not naughty, the King of England.
King Richard's going to come get you.
And I think, there's sort of begrudging respect and things like that. Richard has proved himself there and on the field and everything. And this combined with everything else just means that also we don't know how far Richard actually goes out. He rides out to them, but it's not where exactly is he, and who's around. So, but yeah, I think there's this begrudging respect.
Yeah, those were some really great comments from everyone. So this is our last little point here. The bottom line is Richard wins this battle. He wins the Battle of Jaffa. It's another victory over Saladin. Another Christian victory of the Third Crusade, and Saladin is forced to withdraw. Jaffa is under Christian control. Dr. Donnachie, I guess we'll just jump back to you. What does the Battle of Jaffa tell us about Richard and Saladin's respective positions at this point?
Richard and Saladin have got pretty much the same problem they had after Arsuf. They've had another battle. Richard, once again, is left in control of the field. He's driven Saladin away. He's in control of the objective. Jaffa is safe. Jaffa is protected. The relief army is on its way. Saladin is forced to retire. But as it had happened at Arsuf, while he's given Saladin a bloody nose, and while he's shocked him and mauled his army, the army once again hasn't been destroyed or broken apart. Saladin retires to Ramla, where his son Al-Afdal and his brother Aladil then appear with their own forces. So once again, we're in this sort of deadlock, this stalemate between Richard and Saladin, where both of them are just slugging away at each other, one after the other. But neither's capable, either because they don't have the ability, the resources, the opportunity, the time to actually have a determinative, decisive encounter. And we talk about the Battle of Jaffa quite a lot, and it's very exciting. It's the stuff that good stories are made of. When you think of Richard coming off the boat and everything, and all these battles and the shield wall and riding out, it's all brilliant stuff. And the Western sources quite rightly describe Richard as a sort of Achilles or this Hector with these classical literary kind of epithets. But the one thing I think maybe we forget, and perhaps we should place a bit more emphasis on, is this inexorably advancing Crusader army coming down the coast steadily and slowly with the Templars, the Hospitallers, and the Barons of the King of Jerusalem, and all the other remaining Crusaders who had not gone on the ships with Richard, and are slowly moving down the coast. And Saladin knows they're there, and he knows he's working within a time frame, just as he had been before at Arsuf. And he has to make decisions sooner or later, so that Richard holds out and keeps Jaffa in Christian control, in the control of the Crusaders and the Franks. But somewhere at the back of my mind, once again, there is this army, and Saladin can't or won't commit to an engagement, because if that army arrives, then a battle is going to have to occur, and that might change the entire situation. Where once again, if he withdraws, it's still a stalemate.
Yeah, Christopher Tyerman in God's War, at this point, when he's talking about the Third Crusade, he says the bottom line is that Richard is safe on the coast and Saladin is safe in Jerusalem. So that kind of seems to be what you're saying there. Also, Dr. Donnachie.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sort of there the two shall meet, really,
Yeah. Good comments. Rand, what are your closing remarks here?
I think the real decisiveness of not only this engagement, but also the Third Crusade as a whole. People talk about, and you see this a lot, especially with later historical literature after the medieval period. Especially in like the 18th century, 18th and 19th century historians, really sort of maul Richard. As a historical character. You see a lot of characterization of him as this idealistic, sort of brute warrior who goes and abandons his own kingdom and goes and runs off to a crusade, and all in pursuit of vainglorious success, with fighting Saladin, fighting an unwinnable war and all this sort of thing. And really, when you actually research the sources, it's a very unfair characterization of Richard's actions in the Third Crusade for this. So,
don't mean to interrupt. Sorry,
Dr. Schrader. Rand, if you're done, then it's Dr. Schrader's turn. I mean, she's
absolutely
time for some Dr. Schrader comments here.
Yeah, I would say we've got to get back to what we were just talking about, how demoralized Saladin's army was, because although it's absolutely true what Dr. Donnachie said about the strategic situation, that his army is still intact, theoretically, it hasn't been destroyed, but it's demoralized. Without the victory at Jaffa, Richard would never have been able to get a truce, it was not a peace, get a truce within the next month.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, we shouldn't downplay how important Jaffa was, because without destroying Saladin's army physically, he destroyed it morally.
Right.
He made it very, very difficult for Saladin to continue the war at this point. Saladin had to face the fact he could not order his troops to attack, even though Richard had only a small force. They were flat out disobeying him and refusing to attack. And as Dr. Donnachie points out, and there's a larger Crusader army breathing down his neck. Mm-hmm. So he's forced to withdraw.
Right.
It's not.
Yeah, that's true.
It's worse really than Arsuf, where he pulls back and then he continues attacking the next days, and he didn't quite achieve his objective of destroying the Crusader army. But his troops aren't disobeying him. His troops are still basically there and willing and raring to go. After Jaffa, he's got a disintegrating army on his hands, and his only option right now is to sue for peace with Richard.
I was gonna say the same thing. It's you hit it perfectly. That I mean, to me, this is a far more important and far more decisive victory than Arsuf was, because it really is it really does deal that decisive moral blow to Saladin's forces. And you're right, forces him to come back to the negotiating table.
Yeah, I think everybody's kind of getting at the same thing ultimately, which is that what happens at Jaffa is the Crusader conquest of the coast is reaffirmed. Saladin's whole idea with attacking Jaffa is, what I'm going to do is I'm going to reverse this whole thing that Richard has achieved, which, what Richard has achieved is control of the coast, and especially control of the most important city, Acre. But yeah, Jaffa. What Jaffa shows is the Crusaders really are still the masters of the coast. Yes, Richard has just been forced to give up on the idea of attacking Jerusalem, but when it comes to the port cities, he's in control there.
Mm-hmm.
Does everyone kind of agree with that?
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think that's kind of what all these sort of implications of Jaffa sort of get at. Well, does anybody have any further comments? Have we covered everything we need to about the Battle of Jaffa today?
Guess so.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
I would say no more need be said.
Good, excellent. Well, I was looking forward to this one, and it did not disappoint. Battle of Jaffa is fun stuff. I want to thank everybody for being here. Rand, always great to have your input and kind of get the Marines' perspective on what's going on here. Thanks for being here.
Contribute. Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, and just kind of a little announcement. As I said earlier, Rand he's pretty much taken charge of our blog, and you're going to be seeing some stuff over there on the Real Crusades History blog from Rand. So that'll be fun.
And please, this is to reaffirm what I've posted on there already. Our blog is also open to contributors. If you any Dr. Schrader, Dr. Donnachie, if you all have anything that you would like to see published on there, please send it to me. And we'll post that. We'll have no problem hosting contributors for intellectual content. So please, by all means, it's open to anybody.
Rand, do you have could you send me an email with a link?
I do, and it's also
Okay.
actually, if you go on the website, my
Okay.
email is on there as
Okay.
well.
Yeah, and I'm sure we'll be posting links to a lot of your articles anyway, Dr. Schrader.
Okay, thanks.
Which we've I know we've already posted several. Just hey, go check out Helena's latest blog post. But yeah, absolutely. So Rand's the guy to talk to if you wanna add a little something there. So thanks, Rand, and Dr. Schrader. Again, I want to thank you very much for being here. It is always great to have you.
It's
Done so many of these
fun.
with us, and it's great.
Acting a regular. I know. It's lots of fun. Thanks.
Yeah, we appreciate having you. And let's go ahead and give a little plug for where you can find Dr. Helena Schrader's materials online. She's got her blog, Defending Crusader Kingdoms.
DefendingCrusaderKingdoms.blogspot.com.
Yes, and there will, as always, there will be a link to that in our description here.
Okay.
And and also you're going to want to check out Dr. Schrader's books.
Correct.
On Balian.
Because the Battle of Jaffa will, of course, be a key chapter in the third book in the series, but you'll want to read the first two books first, which are Knight of Jerusalem and Defender of Jerusalem.
Absolutely. Good stuff. And Dr. Donnachie, it is always a great pleasure to have you with us. Thanks so much for being here and contributing your knowledge.
Thank you very much for having me back.
Great. And if you had a blog, this is the part where I would throw out that name, but I guess...
I don't, I'm afraid.
Yeah,
who knows?
Got to get into this.
But you can check out Dr. Donnachie's. He's got some interesting article titles up on his page over there at Swansea. So that's something that you can check out.
Have they gone live yet, Dr.
No,
Donnachie?
not yet. No, I've got to set them off imminently. I'm just sort of a bit prevaricating at the moment.
Right.
Okay.
But the titles
Let
are
us
there.
know.
The titles are there.
The titles are enticing.
They're very titillating. Yeah. So. Okay, well that's it for us. Again, this has been the Real Crusades History podcast. We do one of these podcasts every 1st and 15th of the month. So our next podcast in the Third Crusade series is going to possibly be our most interesting one. It's going to be just sort of an overview, the treaty that takes place after the Battle of Jaffa, the implications of the Third Crusade. What were the long-term effects of the Third Crusade? What did it mean for the Muslim world, for the Christian world? So we'll have everybody on for that. You can find us on realcrusadeshistory.com. Also, we are on YouTube. We do regular videos there on the Crusades. So thanks very much.